By March 1945, the Second World War in Europe had entered a strange twilight phase. The outcome was no longer in doubt. The German Wehrmacht was broken, and Allied armies were sweeping deep into Bavaria. For the men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the primary emotion was not triumph, but exhaustion. They believed the fighting was effectively over, that the remaining task was simply to occupy towns and accept surrenders. But war rarely ends cleanly. On the approach to the medieval city of Aschaffenburg, the illusion of a peaceful end was shattered. It was here that American soldiers, expecting white flags, instead found the bodies of civilians hanging from lampposts. It was here that the rules of engagement shifted. Confronted by a fanaticism that devoured its own people, the American commanders made a grim calculation. They would no longer risk their lives for buildings. They would no longer knock on doors. They would simply erase the city. The twilight of the WWII, the spring of 1945, brought a peculiar atmosphere to the Western Front. By late March, the physical landscape of Germany was one of stark contrasts. In the countryside, the frost was melting, and the fields were beginning to green, signaling the arrival of a new season. Yet, overlaying this natural renewal was the wreckage of an empire in total collapse. The roads were clogged with refugees pulling handcarts, defeated soldiers drifting toward captivity, and the endless, mechanized columns of the Allied advance. For the men of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds, the war had become a rhythmic procession of movement and occupation. These were not fresh recruits. The division had seen combat in Sicily, endured the stalemate at Anzio, and fought its way through the bitter cold of the Vosges Mountains. They carried with them the heavy, accumulated fatigue of years at war. To the average infantryman, the grand strategic questions were irrelevant. The only reality that mattered was that the German army was broken. The coherent front lines had dissolved into isolated pockets of resistance, and the general assumption was that the enemy's will to fight had finally snapped. There was a pervasive, psychological state among the American troops during these final weeks. It was a mixture of relief and extreme caution. No soldier wanted to be the last man to die in a war that was already decided. The desire to survive the final days made units methodical, risk-averse, and heavily reliant on firepower. They expected towns to hang white bedsheets from their windows, a universal symbol of submission that had become a common sight across the Rhineland. The unwritten contract of this phase of the war was simple. The Americans would advance. The Germans would surrender, and the killing would stop. However, as the 45th Division approached the Main River and the city of Aschaffenburg, that contract was about to be voided. Aschaffenburg was not merely another waypoint on the map. It was a city with deep medieval roots, centered around the massive sandstone fortress of Schloss Johannesburg. While the geography was imposing, American intelligence reports suggested nothing out of the ordinary. They anticipated a clearing operation, perhaps some light skirmishing with rearguard elements, followed by the administration of a defeated populace. But the intelligence failed to account for the disintegration of the German chain of command. In the vacuum left by the collapsing Wehrmacht, authority often fell to whoever held the most extreme views. The rational officers, those who wished to spare their cities further destruction, were being supplanted by true believers. In Aschaffenburg, the defense was not being organized by a pragmatist, but by a leadership cadre that viewed surrender as a moral failing punishable by death. As the American columns rolled through the outskirts, the silence of the city was deceptive. It was not the silence of abandonment, but of a breath held. The shuttered windows and empty streets masked a feverish preparation. Behind the walls, the dynamics of the war had shifted from a contest of military maneuver to a desperate, ideological last stand. The soldiers of the 45th, sitting atop their tanks and jeeps, scanned the horizon with the casual confidence of victors. They did not yet know that the rules of engagement were about to change. They did not know that in this quiet Bavarian city, the distinction between soldier and civilian was being erased by the enemy command. The twilight of the Reich was not fading gently into darkness. In Aschaffenburg, it was preparing to burn with a final violent intensity. The Americans were looking for a surrender. What they were walking into was a trap set not just by guns, but by a fanaticism that had lost all regard for human life. The fortress ORDR, to understand why Aschaffenburg was destined to be destroyed. One must look beyond the immediate tactical situation on the ground and examine the rigid, self-destructive logic emanating from Berlin. By the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler's command bunker was a place of delusion, disconnected from the crumbling reality of the front lines. Yet, the orders issued from this void still carried the weight of law. Among the most devastating of these directives was the designation of certain cities as Festeplots, fortified places. This designation was not merely a military classification. It was a binding political covenant. A city declared a fortress was stripped of its status as a civilian habitation and transformed into a static block of resistance. The commander of such a fortress was forbidden to surrender and forbidden to retreat. He was personally answerable to the Führer for every street and every building. In the final nihilistic logic of the Third Reich, the preservation of German cities was secondary to the prolongation of the war. If the city had to be sacrificed to delay the Allied advance by a single day, it was considered an acceptable exchange. In Aschaffenburg, this grim responsibility fell to Major Emil Lamberth. Lamberth was a figure emblematic of the regime's final days. A veteran of the First World War and a committed National Socialist, he possessed a rigidity that superseded traditional military pragmatism. While many Wehrmacht officers in 1945 were quietly looking for ways to save their men and surrender with dignity, Lamberth was consumed by the concept of duty in its most absolute form. He did not view the approaching American army as a force to be negotiated with, but as an enemy to be broken against the stones of the city. Lamberth's problem, however, was a lack of professional soldiers. The regular infantry divisions had largely evaporated or been encircled elsewhere. To defend his fortress, he was forced to scavenge through the wreckage of the local population. He mobilized the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a militia force composed of old men, invalids, and those previously deemed unfit for service. He emptied the local military hospitals, handing rifles to convalescing soldiers who were barely able to stand. Most tragically, he incorporated the Hitler Youth, placing boys as young as 15 into the front lines of the defense. This was a motley, desperate force, ill-equipped to stop a mechanized American Infantry Division. But Lamberth compensated for their lack of training with a terrifying disciplinary code. He understood that the greatest threat to his defense was not the American firepower, but the natural human desire of his own people to survive. To counter this, he instituted a reign of terror within his own perimeter. Lamberth issued a proclamation that was unequivocal. Any soldier or civilian caught attempting to surrender, or even displaying signs of defeatism, would be executed immediately. He empowered roving patrols to enforce this order. This transformed the defense of Aschaffenburg from a military operation into a hostage situation. The civilians were no longer protected bystanders. They were conscripted participants, trapped between the advancing Allied tanks and the execution squads of their own garrison commander. The defense was organized around the city's geography. The steep hills, the narrow, winding medieval streets, and the thick walls of Schloss Johannesburg were integrated into a seamless defensive belt. Lamberth ordered barricades erected and buildings fortified, turning family homes into pillboxes. He was preparing to fight a battle of attrition in an urban environment, a type of warfare that negates the advantages of a technologically superior enemy. As the Americans drew near, Lamberth sent reports to his superiors promising to hold to the last stone. It was a phrase often used as propaganda, but in Aschaffenburg, it was a literal statement of intent. The stage was set for a collision between two opposing forces, the American desire for a quick, clean end to the war, and a German commander's willingness to burn his own city to the ground to prove his loyalty. The tragedy of Aschaffenburg was written in these orders long before the first shell was fired. The betrayal of the civils inside Aschaffenburg. The days leading up to the American arrival were marked by a suffocating dread. For the civilian population, the women, children, and the elderly who had survived 5 years of war and aerial bombardment, the approaching front line represented a paradoxical hope. The arrival of the Americans meant defeat, certainly, but it also meant the end of the air raids. It meant the end of the dying. In the cellars and the bomb shelters, the consensus was quiet but unanimous. The war was lost. And the priority now was to save what remained of their homes and their families. This instinct for survival, however, collided violently with the fanaticism of Major Lamberth. The civilians were not ignorant of the military reality. They knew that if a town offered resistance, the Americans would utilize their heavy weaponry to reduce it. If a town surrendered peacefully, the columns would simply pass through. Consequently, a clandestine movement began to spread through the neighborhoods. Behind heavy blackout curtains, women began to prepare white sheets. Bed linens and tablecloths were gathered, ready to be hung from windows and balconies the moment the first olive-drab tank appeared on the horizon. But the Nazi apparatus in the city was hyper-vigilant. Lamberth and his loyalists understood that the defeatism of the population was as great a threat as the enemy's armor. The city was honeycombed with informers, and the command post maintained a strict surveillance over the mood of the streets. Lamberth's response to the preparations for surrender was swift and performative. He dispatched patrols, composed of SS officers and hardened military police to roam the city, looking for any sign of capitulation. The crackdown began immediately. In the days preceding the battle, the machinery of the German state turned inward. Citizens suspected of planning to surrender were dragged from their homes. There were no trials, no appeals, and no deliberations. The sentence for the crime of wanting to live was death. The executions were designed to be public spectacles. The victims were not taken to a prison yard or a secluded forest. They were hanged from the lamp posts and trees that lined the main avenues and public squares. These were not soldiers who had deserted their posts. They were local grandfathers, shopkeepers, and even women. To ensure the message was understood, the executioners placed cardboard signs around the necks of the dead. The scrawled German script read, "Here hangs a traitor," or "I believed in the Americans." The psychological impact of these displays was absolute. The bodies were left swaying in the wind, a macabre warning to anyone who looked out their window. The message was clear. The Americans might kill you eventually, but Major Lamberth would kill you immediately. The white flags that had been prepared in secret were hurriedly hidden away or destroyed. The hope for a peaceful transfer of power evaporated, replaced by a paralyzed terror. This action by the German command represented a profound betrayal of the traditional social contract of warfare. Historically, the soldier's duty is to stand between the enemy and the home front, to protect the civilian sphere. In Aschaffenburg, that relationship was inverted. The civilians were being used as human sandbags, coerced into the line of fire by their own protectors. By the time the forward elements of the U.S. 45th Division came into view, the city was locked in a grip of fear. The people of Aschaffenburg were trapped in a deadly vice. If they fought, they faced the wrath of the American military machine. If they refused to fight, they faced the noose. The silence that fell over the city was not one of defiance, but of hostage-like compliance. Lamberth had succeeded in stiffening the city's spine, but he had done so by breaking its heart. The Americans were about to arrive, expecting to liberate a conquered people. Instead, they would find a population that had been weaponized against its will. The shock of Antietam on the morning of March 28th. The 2nd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment moved into the suburbs of Aschaffenburg. The soldiers of the 45th Division moved with the casual, slightly guarded posture of men who believed the hard fighting was behind them. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and the profound silence of the streets suggested a city holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable transfer of authority. The tanks rolled slowly, engines idling low, while infantrymen walked alongside, scanning the upper windows for the white sheets that had become the standard currency of German surrender. The silence was broken not by a barrage, but by a single crack of a rifle, then another. Within seconds, the orderly progression of the advance dissolved into a chaotic, close-quarters brawl. The Americans scrambled for cover in doorways and behind garden walls, confused by the source of the fire. There were no distinct enemy lines, no machine gun nests clearly marked on a map. The fire was coming from everywhere, from the attic windows, from the cellar vents, from the church steeples, and from the sewer grates. As the Americans returned fire, the true nature of the battle revealed itself, bringing a sickening shock to the frontline troops. Through the sights of their M1 Garands, they did not see the field gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht infantry. They saw civilians. They saw old men in hunting jackets firing antique rifles. They saw women dropping grenades from rooftops. Most disturbingly, they saw children boys of the Hitler Youth, barely strong enough to lift the Panzerfausts anti-tank weapons they wielded, scurrying between the rubble like ghosts. For the American GI, this was a psychological nightmare. The soldiers of the 45th were hardened veterans, but their training was based on fighting other soldiers. The moral architecture of their war was built on a clear distinction between combatant and non-combatant. Now that distinction had vanished. A hesitation took hold of the line. Men paused before pulling the trigger, unwilling to shoot a figure that looked like their grandfather or their younger brother. That hesitation cost lives. The easy victory rapidly turned into a bloody stalemate. American casualties began to mount, not from heavy artillery, but from the relentless attrition of sniper fire and ambush initiated by the very people they had come to liberate. The ambulances raced back and forth from the rear areas, carrying men who had been shot by teenagers. The confusion on the ground turned into frustration. The Americans were being drawn into a meat grinder, house by house, room by room. But the frustration transformed into something colder and more resolved when the advance units pushed deeper into the main avenues. There, amidst the debris of the skirmish, the soldiers looked up at the lampposts lining the streets. The bodies were still hanging there. The Americans stared at the corpses of the German civilians, men and women who had been executed by Major Lamberth's squads merely for wanting to stop the war. They read the signs hanging around the necks of the dead. Traitor. The soldiers realized the grim reality of Aschaffenburg. These people were not fighting because they believed in victory. They were fighting because they were terrified. They were captives of a fanaticism that would kill them if they stopped shooting. This discovery fundamentally altered the emotional landscape of the battle. The pity the Americans might have felt for the conscripted civilians evaporated, replaced by a furious clarity. They realized they were facing an enemy commander who had suspended all rules of humanity. Major Lamberth had turned the entire city into a weapon, using the bodies of his citizens as a shield. The soldiers of the 45th Division ceased to view the city as a collection of homes to be spared. It became a hostile organism. The sight of the hanging bodies absolved the Americans of the need for restraint. If the German commander was willing to butcher his own people to hold the town, the Americans would not sacrifice their own lives to save it. The hesitation vanished. The moral conflict was resolved. The mood shifted from a mission of liberation to a mission of punishment. ***. the calculus of deistizing to destroy. Aschaffenburg was not made in a moment of blind rage, but in a quiet, tense command post on the outskirts of the city. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry, looked at the casualty reports and the map of the medieval streets. The equation before him was brutal in its simplicity. To continue clearing the city room by room, against an enemy that utilized its own children as combatants and its own citizens as shields, would cost hundreds of American lives. The hangings in the streets had clarified the nature of the enemy. Major Lamberth was not fighting a conventional war. He was fighting a war of annihilation. The American command determined that they would no longer play by rules that the enemy had already burned. The order that went down the line was unusual for an army that prided itself on aggressive infantry tactics. Pull back. The American infantry withdrew from the contested blocks. They abandoned the doorways and the rubble piles, retreating to a safe cordon around the city center. This retreat was not a sign of defeat, but the clearing of a stage. As the infantry pulled out, the heavy machinery moved in. The battle for Aschaffenburg ceased to be a contest of maneuver and became an exercise in industrial demolition. The 45th Division called forward its heaviest assets. They brought up the 155 mm long tom artillery pieces and the fearsome M12 gun motor, Carriage's self-propelled guns designed to crack concrete bunkers. In a standard engagement, artillery is fired indirectly, arching shells high over the landscape to land on unseen targets. But at Aschaffenburg, the doctrine was discarded. The gunners lowered their barrels. They wheeled the massive howitzers to the edge of the city, aiming through open sights directly at the facades of the buildings. It was point-blank siege warfare. Executed with modern high explosives, the bombardment that followed was systematic. The gunners did not fire at random. They dismantled the city block by block. A 155 mm shell, weighing nearly 100 pounds, does not merely damage a timber-framed medieval house. It atomizes it. When the firing commenced, the ancient structures of Aschaffenburg homes that had stood since the 30 Years' War simply disintegrated. Stone turned to dust. Wood turned to splinters. The concussions were so violent that they shook the ground under the feet of the observers miles away. From the skies, the devastation was compounded. Flights of P-47 Thunderbolts dived on the city, dropping 500-pound bombs and strafing the streets. The pilots reported that the smoke rising from Aschaffenburg was so thick it obscured the main river for the American soldiers watching from the surrounding hills. The spectacle was one of grim satisfaction mixed with awe. There was no cheering. They sat on the hoods of their trucks and on the cold ground, smoking cigarettes, watching the city being erased from the map. The psychological detachment was complete. By pulling back the infantry and engaging with heavy ordnance, the act of killing had been depersonalized. It was no longer about shooting a teenage boy in a window. It was about coordinates, trajectories, and payloads. This was the calculus of destruction. The American commanders had weighed the value of German history and property against the lives of their men, and the scale had tipped decisively. General Patton, monitoring the situation, approved of the tactic. He viewed it as a necessary lesson. If the German people allowed themselves to be led by fanatics like Lamberth, if they allowed their cities to be turned into fortresses, then they would share the fate of the fortress. As the sun set, the shelling continued. The fires joined together, creating a firestorm that consumed what the explosives had missed. Inside the perimeter, the noise was apocalyptic. But in the American lines, there was a quiet resolve. They were not going to sacrifice one more GI for Aschaffenburg. They would simply grind it to dust until there was nothing left to defend. The fall of the Siesteruli. After days of relentless bombardment, the city of Aschaffenburg lay in ruins. What had once been a picturesque medieval town was now a landscape of rubble, dust, and smoldering fires. Yet, amidst the desolation, one structure still stood defiant: Schloss Johannesburg. The massive red sandstone castle, built in the early 17th century, dominated the cityscape. Its walls, 8 feet thick in places, had absorbed the shock of the shelling, proving resilient against everything thrown at it. Inside, Major Lamberth and his most fanatical remaining troops, a mixture of SS, hardcore Wehrmacht remnants, and the most indoctrinated Hitler youth, had retreated to its vaulted cellars and fortified towers. Clinging to Hitler's order to defend to the last stone, the American command understood that to declare the city cleared, the castle had to fall. But the decision had already been made. No more American infantry would die storming stone walls. For the final act of demolition, the 157th Infantry brought forward a specialized weapon, an M12 gun motor carriage. This was a brutalist machine, a 155mm M1 gun mounted on a Sherman tank chassis. Designed specifically to breach heavily fortified positions, the M12 was driven to the very edge of the castle's moat, parking directly in front of the main gate. The German soldiers peering out of the ancient arrow slits of Schloss Johannesburg saw the gaping muzzle of the massive gun pointing straight at them, a stark and intimate threat. There was no illusion of distant, impersonal warfare here. This was a direct challenge, a mechanical battering ram against centuries-old masonry. The first shell hit the main tower with a thunderous impact. Stone exploded outwards in a plume of red dust and splinters, revealing the interior structure. The castle, which had withstood the ravages of the 30 Years' War and countless smaller conflicts, began to bleed. The M12 fired again and again, its heavy shells tearing gaping holes into walls that had seemed impregnable. Each round chipped away at the fortress's integrity, exposing its inner secrets to the elements. Inside the castle, the situation rapidly deteriorated. The massive concussions reverberated through the ancient stone, shaking the foundations. Fires broke out in the upper floors, fueled by shattered wooden beams and furnishings. The roof began to collapse in sections, sending cascades of debris into the levels below. The wounded were screaming, their cries echoing through the smoke-filled corridors. Even Lamberth's fanatical corps began to waver. The young Hitler Youth soldiers, still barely more than children, broke down, weeping from fear and the sheer hopelessness of their situation. The pleas for surrender grew louder. "Herr Major, we cannot fight a wall of fire," they cried. But Lamberth, still consumed by his unwavering ideology, pulled his pistol, threatening any man who dared to utter the word surrender. He tried to force them to continue a defense that was objectively impossible. Yet, even absolute fanaticism has its limits when confronted with absolute destruction. The will to live, even for the most indoctrinated, is a powerful force. On the morning of April 3rd, after days of unrelenting pounding, the firing from within the castle finally ceased. A small, ragged white flag appeared from a shattered window, cautiously pushed through a hole in the castle wall. The American guns immediately fell silent. Slowly, the gates of the castle creaked open. The German soldiers who emerged were a horrifying sight. Covered head to toe in red sandstone dust, coughing, stumbling, they looked like ghosts rising from the ashes of their fortress. They were broken, defeated, and utterly spent. And then Major Emil Lamberth emerged. He was still wearing his uniform, his medals pinned to his chest. He walked with a stiff, arrogant bearing, head held high, attempting to project an air of defiant pride to the very end. He approached Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, who had led the 157th Infantry and witnessed the destruction of the city. Lamberth offered a crisp salute and began to speak, perhaps about honor, perhaps about duty. Sparks did not return the salute. He looked past Lamberth at the smoldering ruins of Aschaffenburg, at the smoke still rising, and at the cost in American lives. He looked at the historical monument reduced to a shell, and at the human cost of Lamberth's fanaticism. Without a word, Sparks turned to his military police. "Get him out of my sight," he ordered, his voice flat, "before I shoot him myself." Lamberth was disarmed, stripped of his symbols of authority, and roughly thrown into a jeep as the vehicle drove away. A new set of figures emerged from the cellars of Aschaffenburg, the surviving civilians. They did not cheer the Americans. They turned their wrath on Lamberth. They spat at him, cursed him, shouting epithets like murderer. "And you destroyed our home." The city had been destroyed, the castle reduced to rubble. And the ultimate villain, the man who sacrificed his own people and his own city for an ideology that was already dead, was finally being led away in disgrace. The legacy of Aschaffenburg. Silence that settled over Aschaffenburg in April 1945 was heavy and absolute. The city, which had stood for 1,000 years, was effectively gone. The topographical maps used by the American artillery officers were now obsolete. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to indistinguishable mounds of masonry and timber. The battle had lasted 10 days. In that time, 90% of the city had been destroyed or severely damaged. The cost was paid in the currency of the era: hundreds of American soldiers killed or wounded, an unknown number of German soldiers dead, and the civilian population decimated, buried under the homes they had tried so desperately to save. When General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, visited the ruins shortly after the surrender, he did not view the destruction with regret. He viewed it with a grim, utilitarian satisfaction. Walking among the shattered walls, he remarked to his staff, "It is a good lesson. If they want to fight, this is what happens. We will not trade American lives for German buildings." Patton understood the terrible currency of the war's final months. He realized that Aschaffenburg could serve a purpose greater than its strategic value. He turned the name of the city into a weapon. As his armored columns pushed further into Germany, approaching towns like Schweinfurt and Nuremberg, emissaries were sent ahead with a simple, chilling message: "Remember Aschaffenburg." The ultimatum was clear: surrender the city intact, or face the same annihilation. The threat worked. The specter of Aschaffenburg hung over the remaining weeks of the war. Town mayors and local commandants, hearing reports of the total destruction visited upon the city on the Main River, frequently chose to defy Hitler's scorched earth orders. They opened their gates. They surrendered their garrisons. In a dark irony, the erasure of Aschaffenburg likely saved thousands of lives, both American and German, by proving that the Allies were no longer bluffing. The Americans had demonstrated that they possessed the capacity for total destruction and, more importantly, the will to use it. And what of Major Emil Lamberth, the architect of this catastrophe? He did not die a martyr's death in the rubble. He was taken into custody, but he was not treated as a standard prisoner of war. The U.S. Army put him on trial not for his resistance against American troops, which, however brutal, was an act of war, but for the murder of his own citizens. He was tried for the execution of the civilians who had displayed white flags. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, though in the chaotic judicial landscape of the post-war years, his sentence was eventually commuted to imprisonment. He lived the rest of his life in disgrace, a pariah to the very people he had claimed to defend. The story of Aschaffenburg remains one of the most complex and disquieting chapters of the European theater. It strips away the romanticized notion of the good war. It reveals the moment when the liberating army, pushed to its psychological limit by treachery and fanaticism, chose to become a destroying army. For the soldiers of the 45th Division, the battle was a turning point. It hardened them for the horrors they would soon discover at Dachau. It taught them that mercy was a finite resource, and that when an enemy values ideology over human life, the only response left is overwhelming force. Today, Aschaffenburg has been rebuilt. The castle of Schloss Johannesburg has been restored, its red sandstone walls rising once again over the river. But beneath the restored facade lies the memory of March 1945. It serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of civilization. It stands as a testament to the day when the rules of war were suspended, when a city was held hostage by one man's madness, and when the soldiers of a democracy decided that the only way to end the killing was to burn the world down.